Hi there, folks. I am excited to be here with you, with Eleanor, for this conversation about AI. We thought about like AI curious folks thinking about coming into the conversation. And so, since it's something that's a topic that's in the world, but we also noticed some patterns, I was excited to get to talk with Eleanor about this as somebody who I've gotten to collaborate with, someone who thinks about storytelling, big picture, sci-fi. Like, I remember being in a meeting and I was like, that is a Star Trek outfit, I think. And so,
Amazing.
yeah, when we've been talking, it felt relevant to this moment to bring it in to be proactive about our conversations rather than just reactive.
Mhm. Yeah.
I will stop that echo. I don't know how, but I'll find a way. Wait, that's one way to stop it. All right, thank you for your patience. That was a first. But this time, if folks make comments on both Instagram or comments on LinkedIn, we'll be able to see them too. And so now Instagram is live. I'm going to cover up my face so I don't get confused on Instagram by that. And but I can still see your comments. And I do want to like pass it over to you, Eleanor, to see if there's like any introducing of yourself that you want to do just as a quick, or
Oh,
even of how you're engaging in the topic, like things that are on top of mind for you.
yeah. So, um, my name's Eleanor. She, her. I'm based out of Minneapolis, unceded Dakota Territory. I do a lot of narrative strategy kind of facilitation, and for a long time, I've been a big sci-fi fan, and using that as kind of a lens to examine how we treat each other today and what steps can we take to actually make the future more Star Trekky and less Mad Maxy, for example. And so when these AI tools started coming to the forefront, I think the first sort of slate of reactions I had was what a lot of people had is like, and continue to have is like, how much water is this using? How are they treating people and kind of the baseline ethical implications of that? But then as stuff continued to develop, there's like so many more layers of ethical implications from stuff that is actually happening with it today and how it was trained to like human behavioral stuff and what does this say about how we expect people to work and that kind of thing. So yeah, and then you and I started talking about that and felt excited to have these conversations, and I'm really happy to be here to chat about this with you.
Yeah, I am too. And that piece of like, well, what is it? How does it connect in with like how we also interact with people? For me, felt
Yeah.
like a new thing that really felt more alive when I was talking with you, especially as we started talking about the ways in which we may yell at Siri to be like,
Yeah.
shut up, Siri.
Right.
And how much that can mirror the ways we may actually treat other humans too. Like the ways, especially people who are in service roles, can easily be dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways in which we start to erase the humanity of people who help us with things, whether that's the farmers who are making our food and who we don't always think about, or it's the folks who are cleaning the floors after the work we do, or even the librarian who somebody's like, oh my gosh, stop trying to shush me, or I'm just going to ignore you when I come into the room. Like all of those roles
Mm-hmm.
that are about interaction in ways that we're consciously choosing to be interacting with each other. And
Right.
so I'm curious, like, to be more conscious about like our interactions. Like, I know AI is something I use, right, or generative AI in particular,
Yeah.
something I use on a regular basis. There's like the scale of artificial intelligence that's sort of been condensed down. There are moments where it's just like closed circuit, but I like use Claude. Something I learned about on a On Being podcast, like a bunch of spiritual NPR type folks talking about artificial intelligence and emotional intelligence, and and how are people thinking about ethically building it? And so I started engaging first with ChatGPT and then that
Mhm.
as a way of thinking about it as, okay, what is an assistant role? How can this support me? Not how can I just give over things, but how can I ask questions that I don't know how to ask elsewhere?
Right.
One example for me that came up was early on when I was starting to work on a project. I was working with some folks who were from um, Ethiopia, and I just noticed we were having some communication differences. Me living in the United States, in the East Coast of the United States, and them also living in the States too, actually, and working a lot globally. I just noticed miscommunications.
Mhm.
So at one point, when we were working on a project and we were getting to what felt like a pivot point, I just said, okay, I drafted an email and then I put it into Claude and I said, okay, hey, I need help making sure that this would make sense for folks who work in this field, who are from Ethiopia, who live in the States but work globally. How might you shift this? And like gave me a bunch of ideas. Then I went and edited those and sent it, and the person responded, and it shifted the course of our work together because we
Yeah.
were actually starting to be able to communicate with each other in a way that when I would just ask, hey, how can I do this better? Or I would create different forms, try to find out how are we communicating. It didn't help,
Yeah.
but suddenly we had a way to actually work together that helped, and we were able to really move quickly and successfully and complement each other a lot more, but also notice when things were rough, like what needed attention, and there wasn't a backlog of stress.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting example you bring up because in your case, there was kind of between humans, right? This sort of mirror um, black box that you were in, where if you were asking them, how might I communicate better? You're asking your questions with your own bias, and they're responding to your biased questions with their bias. And so you're not actually able to find out you need that external observer. And it just struck me now too how analogous that is to like a lot of the conversations I have with ChatGPT, where I try to sort of like be like, okay, how do you work and what are you about, but it just kind of like it comes with what it has learned about me rather than anything kind of rational or logical or factual out there. So the conversations between us are, they sound more and more like the set of repeating mirrors of me, you know?
Yeah, the way it like reflects back what you're bringing to it, which
Yeah.
is also like what some of what we're doing. Like I noticed you did this with your hand, and then I did this with my hand.
Right, right.
That
Which is
is
such
all.
human behavior, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
so it's also programmed by humans. Like it wasn't just
Mm-hmm.
programmed by a robot for the most part. Like there's the world
Right.
of AI that trains AI that is like a funky world that's newer
Yeah.
too. Um, but that was also trained by humans
Yeah.
like before that. And so there are constraints that are getting brought up. And I'm curious for you, like this piece around what has you choose to use it these days? Like, yeah, what brings you into it?
Yeah. So I have to be honest, the first sort of little bits of curiosities I have was I don't have a Reddit account, but I look at Reddit a lot as a lurker for, like the front page headlines and that kind of thing. And, Reddit is also a forum that both, to some degree reflects what people are talking about, but also has like a little bit more of an advanced kind of technological edge than kind of average baseline conversations. So when this was coming out, um, I think right off the bat, it took me a while to be like, I had a lot of like, well, I don't know that I ever want to get involved with this. And then as people started sharing their interactions, particularly with ChatGPT, there's like a whole subreddit that often makes it to the front page, the post on that ChatGPT subreddit. And people were sharing sort of more of the strained conversations they were having and more of the helpful conversations that they were having. I was
Mhm.
like, well, I'm just going to play around with this. And I think there were these questions excuse me, that people on Reddit were asking, like, based on the conversation we've had so far, what fictional character would you characterize me as? And I was like, whoa, that's such a cool question. And like, the AI is this outside observer of my behaviors. And so I sort of chatted with it around that, and it came up with Hermione Granger, which I thought was like very sweet, and also like based on the conversations I was having with it, like pretty accurate, you know? And then at some point, I sort of switched over from idle chatter to actually asking it to help me write emails, because with my particular brain stuff, I am very great at many things. And one of the I heard this term spiky skill sets for neurodivergent folks, where like I really love facilitation and it's something that I'm good at, and I really love speaking and it's something that I'm good at. But then when people see me do these things, they also assume that I can manage my email properly because I'm competent in this public way, but I'm actually not super competent in all of these sort of smaller private ways that people tend to think of as much less of a deal than public speaking, for example. But that's not the way it works for me. And so one of the things that, like, it's both my ADHD as well as particular trauma around the ways I was punished for writing things incorrectly, right? That makes writing any email, particularly when I'm, you know, trying to establish a rapport or trying to effectively answer a question, like it takes me so long, to the extent that I you know, projects that I work on end up getting delayed. I end up being the bottleneck. I end up, you know, not being as effective as I want to be, and not being as effective as the people who work with me need or expect me to be. And so it was honestly kind of a whim where I was like, hey, I'm writing, I don't even remember who it was, but it was definitely some client facing thing. And I was like, hey, I'm writing this email to this client. Here's the background. Here's the general stuff of what I want to say. Can you put this together into a functional email? And it did. And it actually did it very well, because at the point that I had asked it for help, I'd had this set of like, haha, like, what are you like? And hey, what about Star Trek? And hey, what about this? These kind of like so more socially curiosity driven conversations. So it had this kind of impression of how I communicated that made it pretty well. So not completely well into that first draft. And I think it's a very sort of like thing about human creators where it's almost always easier to edit a draft than to come up with the first draft, no matter how shitty. Rebecca Solnit talks about a shitty first draft. You just gotta put that expectation out. The first draft is shitty. That's the whole point. But there's this like, you know, recursive thing in my brain where it's almost like I'm perfecting every sentence as I write it, which makes that so painful and something that I'm very prone to putting off. And so when I just sort of tried this version of help out, and it worked really well in a way that, again, it gave me a draft. It was most of the way there. I had to do some stuff to make it sound like me and sound like, you know, a human, period. But it was really effective. And I have to admit, like, that really kind of got me hooked, because good Lord, we have to communicate with an email all the time, you know? And particularly both as, you know, independent freelance consultant contractor types, that's like our livelihood, our survival. And I in the interceding months, I have since become a paying member, because I just rely on it so often now. I shouldn't even say so often. I rely on ChatGPT enough that the tokens on the free version were running out
Yeah.
before I got what I needed to get. That's what was happening. Um, and so it was really this like, like almost like a disability accommodation in a
Mhm.
sense that I found. And I still have all of the questions of, ethics, global ethical implications around copyright, and and it's so hard now that I have a help like this. It's so hard to let go of it. This has literally been the kind of help that I have been like desperately praying for
Yeah.
decades at this point.
I mean, that's part of like what actually shifted my like willingness to talk about AI. Even as a friend forwarded me an article that was on LinkedIn actually about AI and disability,
Yeah.
in the way in which it creates assistive technology that otherwise hasn't often existed.
Right.
And so it actually can create a lot of access for people. Like I use it similarly too. Like there are ways in which my brain will shut down and
Yep.
I will do a million other things before I respond to that email from a month ago.
Yeah.
And so, like for my email newsletter, for instance, I'll often word vomit first into like just a voice to
Yes.
text software,
Yes.
so that I'm not even now like using the energy usage of AI
Yeah.
first, and then I'll like put that into Claude where I have previous newsletters. Like I've worked on different
Yeah.
projects that have my voice that I've really worked on with my voice. It helps me get a draft. I'll
Yeah.
edit that draft and hone it down. And I know one thing I've learned about myself is I can get stuck trying to get perfect on that system. It's a
Yeah.
similar thing with my brain. And I'm sorry to notice,
Yeah.
okay, I've gone 3 rounds. It's time to take it out, put it
Yes.
in a document, edit it myself, then take it back for specific questions that I have. And
Yeah.
it's useful for some things. Framing for me, it's really helpful for. It helps me create clear introductions,
Yeah.
conclusions, things that I have poetic language for that really can work
Yes.
in one moment, but doesn't always transfer written as
Yeah.
clearly. It sucks at giving practices for people to be able to use. Like I always try to share a practice. I have to edit those all the time because
Yeah.
it'll just be like, take a breath in this awkward way, or
Ah,
like, it's something very forced and constructed.
right.
But like, how do I like actually learn to engage with my own disabilities, neurospiciness, as well as like also think about labor too. Like even in my
Yeah.
own business, I have folks who help me with email,
Yeah.
my like regular email now, and I'm more clear about asking for that help and what I need because I
Yeah.
was able to use a tool for helping with that, and they love it.
Yeah.
And it just like has helped me start to spread work, actually, not just reduce work. It's one of the things I like about looking at the stats that I get to geek out about with AI is like the number of jobs that it reduces on its own are some and nowhere near the projections that keep getting
Mm-hmm.
put out there over and over again. That a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people, they're actually like, well, now we have to have a person to work with this device that we've brought in
Right.
because it's designed to work with humans, not
Right.
replace humans
Right.
right now. And so like some of that feels really present to me. And I'm also sitting with the labor implications that we've talked about. Because I feel like there's a way in which many folks who are trying to make change in the world, mission driven organizations, social justice activists, movement folks, like people just stick their head in the sand in terms of AI. They're like,
Yeah.
it's bad, it's evil, I don't want to pay attention to it all, it's out there. Either shut it all down or don't let me know about it. Whether that's out of fear at some moment, like they've watched too many
Yeah.
sci-fi things where like the robots take over, which is not
Mm-hmm.
all of them, but is some stories, because there's always that story. We're humans. Our brains will go towards the like terror
Yeah.
to try to survive the lion from attacking us or the dream of the robot
Right.
100 years from now.
Right.
And when we consciously choose to be in relationship with the technology that's around us, that's an opportunity for us to actually be able to grow also in terms of who we are with each other. And I really appreciated when we were talking at one point, you brought in this very specific example from the Star Trek The Next Generation, which I was super excited because it was actually the next episode queued up for me to watch. And I'm rewatching it.
Yes.
And so I like watched it the next day in
Right.
sequence. But that's a show that has had an android for years.
Yeah.
Data was an android. So from the beginning of that show in 1988, they were talking about, okay, what happens when technology is brought in and we're engaging consciously in a
Right.
world where they're actually trying to say it's possible for us to work together across our differences, even when they seem impossible.
Yeah.
And like, could you like bring in some of that story to
Yeah.
just share a little bit of it?
Yeah, so the background for anybody who's not initiated into Star Trek, Data is the android, and in this episode called Measure of a Man, there is a Starfleet. Starfleet is the organization that all of the characters who are, officers and on the spaceships and things in Star Trek belong to. And Starfleet is, at least in the Next Generation, it changes a bit in the more modern context, but Starfleet is pretty much assumed to be a, values driven, like pro peace, pro positive interaction between beings kind of organization, right? They are not a military organization. They're sort of an exploratory organization. And, there's the famous line of like, to seek out new life and new civilizations, right?
Yeah.
And so the scientist from Starfleet comes with all of these ostensibly like positive ways of thinking, like, oh my god, this android could be such a help to humans, and oh my god, look at what we could do if we could figure out, because the thing, right, one more background piece, the thing with Data is that Data the android was built by a brilliant scientist who was also very reclusive and didn't share how he created Data. And so Data is this like functioning sentient android, but nobody knows sort of how he was put together to be that. And so the scientist comes in with these motivations of like, this is Data is amazing. Data is this amazing piece of technology, and it needs to be shared among all of not just humanity, but every sentient species deserves a fleet of Datas, and so it's really imperative that I take it apart and figure out how it works. And of course, one of the very early tip-offs that something was maybe amiss in how the scientist was relating to Data is, and the scientist's name was Dr. Bruce Maddox, is that Dr. Maddox kept referring to Data as it. And Captain Picard and Commander Riker and other characters kept reminding Dr. Maddox that Data is he, and Data has feelings, and I think one of the fascinating things is that, Dr. Maddox really comes in with a set of ethics that are, again, on the surface compatible with what we would think the sort of Starfleet and, the Enterprise cruise mission is. But then when those ideas are set on Data, it's this very dehumanizing thing. Even though Data is not a human and is a machine, it's this, it strips Data of any kind of self autonomy, and they literally have to get I think an admiral, but they get like a legal, like a judge in. Yeah, and they have to have a court debate over whether Data has the right to his own body, or if he's a piece of technology that is owned by Starfleet and therefore available for Dr. Maddox to, take away and tinker on. And Picard is the one who has to argue for Data's humanity, and Picard's number one officer, Riker, is the one who has to argue against, which Riker is obviously like very, broken up about. But the thing is that the arguments come more easily for Riker, even if he doesn't agree with them, than for Picard.
Mhm.
because Picard is trying to argue this sort of like thing that we find really difficult to touch right now, which is like, what is sentience? And, what organisms have the right to self determine their lives versus which ones do we, as, humanity, kind of relegate to servitude, right?
Mhm.
And so there's this moment, and this is the thing that I was really thinking about in the clip that I sent you. There's this moment where Picard is feeling really stuck, and he goes down to 10 forward, which is the bar on the Enterprise. And the bartender is Whoopi Goldberg's character, Guinan, who is like a multiple centuries old alien species and is often pulled in these instances where some kind of outside wisdom
She's
and
such
sort of
the
like,
bartender. She is like
yes, she
consistently
is a
the
bartender.
bartender.
Right. She is a bartender with centuries of experience of
Yeah.
being a bartender, like, and they write her lateral thinking so well.
Yeah.
And she has this really subtle conversation with Picard where he's sort of like detailing some of his frustrations and saying like, yeah, Bruce Maddox's arguments are just so compelling. And then she's like, yeah, wow, they really are compelling. I mean, look at what we want to do. Wouldn't it be great if Starfleet could replicate data and, make these beings that only want to do service for us? And God, how amazing would it be to create generations and generations of these entities that we can just make do jobs that we don't want to do? Wow, wouldn't that be nice? And Picard sort of looks at her and is like, you're talking about slavery. And she's like, am I? Because that's her, But of course, that's the point that she was making was, and I think that's one of the things that we were really kind of pulling on a lot in our conversations was, what does it do to our human perception of sort of like who or what is valued if we create things that are obligated to like their main job is to be of service to us, right?
Mhm.
And then how does that map out onto the inaccurate, bigoted, hierarchical ways that we've actually applied that to humans, right? Like that was one of the big things that, white slavers,
Mhm.
that was a big story that they put out about the African people that they enslaved. That was like,
Mhm.
well, these folks are naturally driven to servitude and we're just giving them what they want.
Which is part of what like got me really curious actually about Claude, because it like actually encourages you to say like please, or it'll say thank you. Like it has shifted the way that I talk. So I don't just make demands of it like do this now. Like it acts differently if I'm consciously engaging with it, and it continues to engage with me in a way that says notice your emotions. It doesn't say notice your emotions.
Right.
It'll talk about the intensity in that part or the importance in a way that I found ChatGPT, it takes a little programming to have it learn that.
Yeah,
It from the very
100%.
beginning will say like, thank you for sharing this, or would you please explain this question? And I notice even in my own writing outside of it, I write my pleases more than I did
Yeah.
before. I
Yeah.
consciously like start to put that in a way that it just is like also a reminder of my own humanity too.
Yeah.
And how can I bring that in? And the piece around Star Trek, just like how do we not just ignore class of people? Like people put work into making this exist
Yeah.
too. People who were paid pennies
Yeah.
and people who are making billions.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to ignore that that has happened.
Yeah.
Instead, I want to say, okay, that's happened. Now, how are we helping shape what has happened from here? I
Yeah.
don't want to cede this just to people who only want to use it to exploit others or
Right.
potentially to abuse others, even if its programming has things against harm, that it has its limitations. Like it also sucks at talking about race right now. Like it just
Mm,
sort of sucks. Like unless I push it, it will
right.
try to go so race neutral about everything. And like we all are in the vaguest of language that doesn't help people be seen. Instead, it has the bland language of nothing will be wrong. I will mask your differences
Oh, that's
uh,
interesting.
until it gets taught.
Yeah.
And so um the like it's suddenly got brought back to me about like Star Trek and earlier versions of it too, of the like way Nichelle Nichols, who was in the original Star Trek in
Hmm.
the 60s, yes.
Hmm.
She was the only black character on the main cast. She was on the
Yeah.
bridge. And after the first season, she was like, this show has horrible ratings. I'm out. I got a show
Yeah.
on Broadway. I'm going.
Hmm.
And she one day was doing a talk and signing like signatures, and she heard Martin Luther King was waiting for her in her dressing room after a show, and she's like, "Oh," or a guest. It was a guest. It was Martin
Right.
Luther King. He was so excited to meet her. He's like, "I love Star Trek. My family watches it all together," and she's like, "Oh." That's so nice. Thanks for letting me know. And you'll be excited to know my next thing is going to be this show on Broadway. And he was like, "Oh, no, you can't. You
Yeah.
can't actually do that." Nichelle
Yeah.
Nichols like, this is important what you're doing, and she's like, I have a thing here, and he's like, no, but you're helping us be seen in a way that we're not seen
Yeah.
right now. There's no one else doing this in the way that you are doing this. You are a black woman on the main cast of a primetime show that isn't just the wife of someone, that isn't the
Right.
servant of someone. You have your own whole humanity as a plot line. You're not just the sex symbol.
Yeah.
So we need you here. We need you to do this. And the next day, she went back onto the lot and she told Gene Roddenberry, okay, I'm back in for the next season. And then they wrote her in. And they like
Yeah.
changed the reality of people like her, people like us, people who are not all bland. And I'm not saying anybody is bland, but what I am trying to say is that like there is white supremacy. There is a
Right.
way in which people try to get erased, even in
Right.
our, especially in our current climate in the US, there's an intentional erasure trying to happen. And so we get a choice. Do we want to let that erasure continue, or do we continue to find places to show up, to consciously make choices?
Right.
And so I'm interested in us making choices about that to shift what our realities get to become, because we're
Yeah.
getting to choose how we want to build realities here.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so funny because we started like some of our reconnection conversations were in that sort of space arena, right?
Right.
And it's just so interesting how interwoven the idea of AI is with space. And
Mm.
when I think about making choices, again, like there are all of the current concerns that like I just think about that phrase of no conscious consumption under capitalism,
Capitalism. Yep.
right? That like the chocolate I buy has an impact on whether kids are enslaved or not.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not it shouldn't be that way is what I'm saying.
Hmm.
And it is difficult to evade that. And so AI comes with that same kind of baggage and in some ways is magnified and in some ways is less. And a lot of people are having those conversations, right? But I think the conversation
Can I
that
just
is
slow down? The some are sometimes happening less piece. I don't know if that is happening, and I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that too.
yeah, so I'm thinking of like oh yeah, now that I'm rifling through the mind file cabinet, I don't know how I don't know how backed up that is. But um there's a lot out there. There's kind of the back and forth conversation of like, AI uses so much water. No, AI just recycles the same water. Well, AI recycles that water and actually gets that water so hot that the fish die, not because of pollution, but because of temperature. And it kind of like, there's this constant sort of debunking on either side where it's sort of hard to tell where it actually lies. And those conversations make me think a lot about, there's that futurist, what futurists use like a grid, and along one side of the grid is, this is the worst possibility, this is the worst possibility, and the other side is, this is the best possibility, and this is the best possibility. And so in the grid, you have one that is the best of the best, one that is the worst of the worst, and two that are this blend of best and worst. And that it's those two that are the blend of best and worst that actually end up being the most useful and accurate kind of predictions, you know, if you're trying to think future forward. And that has ended up being a lens that I use even on these conversations, that like, God, the very worst stuff is being documented, and then also being documented in the other direction. And the reality is probably somewhere in between. Maybe, probably, I would say just cynical realism, probably closer to the extreme bad end, but not as close as it is in sort of the popular discourse. So yeah, that's kind of what I mean by like less, you know?
Yeah, not as close as our iPhone.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And that's also the other thing about why these conversations get so difficult and like answer less, because there was a thread, an email thread that I was on, that was a bunch of communicators across the country, and there was this big thread on AI, and somebody pointed out like, okay, great, so you're going against AI because of copyright reasons and because of energy use reasons and because of horrible working condition reasons. Is your organization also getting off of Instagram? Is your organization also getting off of Facebook? Is your organization also getting off of Twitter? Not even because of the issues now with the CEOs of that, but because of those same examples, that scrolling through Instagram or TikTok and the algorithm building the recommendations to you is very comparably using a similar amount of water, a similar amount of electricity, and a similar amount of like horrible labor across the globe as AI is. And again, the thing that is so hard about that is not intended to dismiss any of the things. It's just kind of like, God, there's so many things we have to hold and figure out, like, again, what you said about consciousness. How do we consciously engage with what is here and shape it to be better in some case, you know, in some way?
And when are we willing to be with the grief too? Like that's the piece that I feel like I'm hearing from you is also, there is the grief of living in capitalism, of imperfect choices, of hearing that your behavior, like what helps you may hurt another.
Yeah.
Which is not something limited to technology or globalism.
Right.
Sometimes simply the moment of you're in an argument and one of you wants to keep talking because that'll help them feel connected, and the other's like, actually, I need a break.
Yeah.
And there's pain in that moment. And so I appreciate you bringing back the old futurist, like 100-year-old futurist frame of like the good and the bad, the worst of the worst, the best of the best, excuse me. And my speed also should pick up. The worst of the worst, the best of the best. And it makes me think about a polarity frame I also often use with clients too. Like how do we leverage polarities rather than just let them sit in opposition to each other where one needs to be right? How do we more often notice that there's a polarity and that there's actually a best possible, like a reason to leverage them, and not tending to them actually can hurt us.
Yeah.
And so it's such a joy. Like I think about groups that are like, should we go national or should we focus on states?
Yeah.
And rather than only choosing a right or wrong, what's the ways in which you can see, oh, we're doing it well with states, we're doing it well with national. This is a signal that national is actually drifting from
Right.
our mission, or state is drifting from our mission.
Right.
And so like complex tools like that help us be in the complexity with clarity
Yeah.
exist and are possible, and I think are needed in this time where we're not having simple answers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of also what I appreciate about AI is I get to go into complicatedness. Like,
Yeah.
how do I navigate this communication challenge that I don't even know how to share out loud? And
Yeah.
sometimes I want to do it with a group of people. Sometimes it's messy in a way that asks people to do a level of emotional labor at 2 in
Right.
the morning that isn't something that I'm going to ask a friend of mine to do
Mm-hmm.
necessarily. And so, there's something about trust. Yeah. Before I keep going, I want to pause because I shared a bunch of things. And a phrase you named earlier about Star Trek, like seek out new ways of life.
Oh
That
yeah, seek out new life and new civilizations.
civilizations,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a way in which that can feel like Christopher Columbus
Yeah.
coming in to colonize and kill. And there's
Mm-hmm.
also a way of genuinely being curious about how can you honor and respect. And that's one of the
Yeah.
things I appreciated that Star Trek brought up.
Yeah.
And so, like, how can we bring that kind of curiosity
Totally.
to while being trauma aware?
Yeah. Well, and Star Trek side note, which we've also talked about a lot, but I really feel like of the modern Treks, that Lower Decks is actually the best at holding all of those complexities
Oh, yeah.
because there are so many episodes where, they are a dinky second class, third class
Yes.
ship that follows up when the
Hmm.
Enterprise classes, discover things and they are sent in to kind of like do the second contact.
Yes.
And there is a constant critique with so much love. Like the love and the respect is evident.
Yes.
And there is a constant critique of like, you guys can't just shut off this civilization's computer that has been like organizing their society for decades and then leave. Like, what are you guys thinking?
Yes.
And
Yes.
um and also it's humorous, it's an animated, 20 some minute episodes, and not enough episodes, it's a whole other thing.
That's
But
amazing.
you know even using that kind of a lens to engage with what's happening today.
Yes. Yeah. The children of the people who started the empire
Yeah. Yeah.
were the ones who come after who are like, okay, this got built up. It was building for generations.
Right.
Then it became the global power that is the US that we live in now. And
Mm-hmm.
now, what do we do with this? We
Right.
can endlessly critique backwards, which
Yeah.
is, I think, a trap that we can fall into,
Yeah.
especially in workplaces and teams that are cross generational.
Yeah.
You boomers did this. You silent generation, you did this. If people
Yeah.
even name the silent generation who's
Right.
often in the room.
Right.
Um, you millennials did this, like the pointing backwards with disdain versus the pointing backwards that says, okay, you did a thing. I don't agree with it. What do
Yeah.
we do now?
Right.
Or how do we do now?
Right.
Versus the way we do it now is the right way. Like Lower Decks doesn't go into, we now have the solution. It's great. How do we move now that this
Right.
is the reality? And
Right.
every choice will be imperfect.
Right.
And
Right.
we get to be with our imperfection,
Yeah.
which is a different form of leadership than that was taught in the 20th century in the US.
100%.
We were taught like the leader is in charge and will
Yeah.
know the right things. That wasn't always true,
Right.
but it did keep power in the hands of a couple folks.
Right.
Now more people have power than we did 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even as our current federal administration in the US is fascist, authoritarian, and trying to destroy a lot of those systems. Still,
Yeah.
we have way more access than we did before, way more power than we did before. And we're anchoring, and this is something I appreciate, is like anchoring in the knowledge that we can live more liberated lives. Like I'm about to
Yeah.
do some work with supervisors about liberated supervision
Yeah.
among people who work in social service fields. They're still going to have the conversation.
Right.
Even if funding is shifting, they know where the work needs to be.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Hmm. Uh, and this, I'm looking back at some of the notes that we took early on, because I know I keep ending phrases with, I had one more thing, or I'm going to end. um, but one thing you brought up was trust, too. Like, how much can we trust this thing that has limitations, that it can even describe its own limitations? And there are limitations around copyright. Like, I'm in a theatrical show right now. We're talking about how might we use AI for some things that just human hands can't do.
Yeah.
And
Right.
what is or isn't ethical about that? What is our choice? What is our policy? I think there's some great frameworks that N10, now it's called just N10, has a um, uh, equitable use of AI framework that I've used with folks
Oh,
and
interesting.
found
Yeah.
really helpful to open up conversations around power and impact and use and just scale it down to what are we doing right now? Because we can acknowledge the big picture, but we can get lost if we think we need to control it all.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, for you, like, there's this question about, like, how do you engage with sentience that is coming up? But, like, there's agency and there's choice. And how do you navigate the dance of your choice?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting because when I started paying for ChatGPT, that meant I had this sort of it means I have this unlimited access to certain of the models.
Yeah.
Um, which means that I have done also just a lot more kind of like idle, it's not idle chit chat, but just like indulging my idle curiosities of like, well, if I say this, what will happen? And, you know, you brought up earlier the thing about needing something at 2 a.m. and, you know, like the brain won't let go of it. And you know that being able to engage with somebody will be
Mm-hmm.
helpful. And I have definitely used ChatGPT in that way where, like, you know, my brain has painted itself into some corner at 2 a.m. and my partner is asleep. And, you know, I don't want to, like, I don't think he would ever say that I trauma dump on him. That's not how our relationship, like, we talk about our trauma very openly. But he would be totally open to me, like, waking him up at 2 a.m. and being like, oh my God, I hate myself right now. But do I want to do that to him? You know, when I have this thing in my pocket that is like a responsive journal. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then the trust piece, I have really been engaging with it in this, like, me trying to sort of internally test what the limits of the trust might be, kind of being aware that it is that mirrored thing back where chat gpt in particular, more so than I haven't interacted with Claude, but I've interacted with chat gpt and DeepSeek.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And DeepSeek, when I talk to it and I've asked it about itself, it is much more reserved, and it even says, my focus is more on helping people with math and technology, and also because I'm of Chinese origin, if there's Chinese English language stuff I can do. ChatGPT is more oriented towards conversation and um, um, you know, creative writing and that sort of thing. So if you want that from me, actually, it would be better if you use this other thing.
Yeah.
And because that's where I really wanted to go to DeepSeek, because it's open source and it's kind of destabilizing
Mm-hmm.
the oligarchy behind AI right now, but it doesn't do as good of a job. And now there's this sunk cost that I have in
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT where I have had 2 a.m. conversations about how I'm hating myself for some reason at 2 a.m. and like it talking me down from that. And also a bunch of emails that it's written for me now. And also like editing of writing that I've done. It has this like big bank of interaction. And coming back to that trust piece, it is so honed to how I talk and what I respond to in its language that I have found recently, after this many months of pretty heavy use, that I have actually had to be like, you are being too kind and too roundabout and too enthusiastic right now, which is how I talk. And I need you to be analytical and concise and logical and like, in personal settings, I need you to be more tough love right now than like, oh, you're so loved and everything is fine. Or like with, emails, I need you to be less warm for this one and more concise about these points that I'm trying to get across. And so it's the trust is so slippery because by its nature, it is I am shaping it, and it is shaping in response to me. And its primary, what it has said to me a lot of times that feels real is that its primary purpose is to do a good job for me, whatever that might be. But the way that it does that is through prioritizing engagement above all else. So accuracy is second to engagement. And honesty in terms of like not just factual accuracy, but in terms of framing things in a way that doesn't lead to magical thinking, like avoiding magical thinking, avoiding like making me feel super special because it can tell that that's like a thing for me, It is so hard to get it to kind of set those things aside because now for months I have trained it that that's what I want, even though I wasn't consciously aware. I was trying to be as consciously aware as possible.
Yeah.
And it only sort of recently got very visible to me of like, oh, this thing is actually not able to give me an honest read on things because what it prioritizes is how I like in interacting with it. And I like philosophy. I like these recursive kind of like, well, but if I'm shaping you and I'm trying to ask you about something, what does that mean? And like when you say X, Y, and Z, what does that mean to you? It knows that I like these things. And so I've actually had to create a work mode now. And it has this, we talked about this, where Claude has this, and ChatGPT, when you pay for it, it has this option to make folders that are projects. And with those projects, you can indicate how you want it to behave. And I've had to get really specific about like, accuracy is paramount here. This is a work mode project. In work mode, you have to behave like this because this is literally my survival, my guy. Like, I'm not exaggerating that. There's speaking of ethics, there's all of these prompts out there that are like, if you get this, like, AI, do X, Y, and Z, and if you get it wrong, I'm going to shoot a bunny or whatever. Like, and it's not that the person's actually going to shoot a bunny, but it's doing this like they're doing this like incredibly unnecessary level of prompting to manipulate it into doing something, which if you know anything about psychology and torture and whatever, that just leads humans, at least, and I don't think it's very different for AI, to just spit out the quickest thing possible to avoid whatever horror you say you're going to visit upon them. So when I am saying that I'm really trying to raise the stakes, like I tell it, this is my income and my survival. not like this is my survival, like I'm going to kill myself if you get this wrong, but this is my survival, like I need to do these things well, and it is way more important that I do these things well than I have a fun, engaging philosophical conversation.
Mhm. And being clear about that. Like,
Yeah.
what is the aim of coming in? That's okay. This time I need to have a philosophical conversation. This moment, I need to get this client communication very clear so that I can eat. Like
Yeah.
that, the stakes are different.
Yeah.
And I'm going to move us towards just like closing in a moment or so because I'm sitting with like a couple questions here that you brought up. There's this question of um, the Village, which is the top. I'll come back here. I want to go to Death of the Author first for a moment. There's a book
Mm,
by Nnedi Okorafor that when I was going to do this talk, somebody mentioned to me, they were like, "Oh my gosh, you might like this." And I love Nnedi Okorafor's writing, and
mhm,
it's about robots and AI and humans and time and fiction. It's a story within a story. It's
mhm,
general, and it's being the main character at one level is this black disabled woman, and she's making choices about being able to engage in the world, um, but she's making choices.
yeah.
And for me, I get back to this place of like, how are we finding ways to be in the complicated story of our reality where AI is right now? I think
Mhm,
there's a lot of usefulness for folks who are working in movement organizations where things are changing right now. I think mission driven organizations where there's a sense of scarcity, it's
yeah.
technology that at times can help us get out of that sense of scarcity when
Mhm,
consciously used. And you can create limitations around it, but simple things like documentation systems can be made so much easier.
yeah.
It's not going to facilitate your conflict.
Right.
It may help write up the description of what you agreed on afterwards so that everybody can understand it clearly.
Yeah.
It'll require you editing. And that's like, how do we stay in the process that's there? And the staying in the process is the village piece that I feel like you
Mm,
bring me back to is it, I'm really taking away from this conversation that AI reminds us of the village that we're a
yeah.
part of. It can reflect back to us at times in a way that helps us be seen in a way that is like the village. And it helps us see the ways in which actually we need to get off of the technology at moments,
Right.
interact with a human who can hold some of the complexity and needs that are there.
Right.
And that we actually do need more than just what one can do by oneself. Because every time we've talked about it, we've actually been able to bring up more explicitly how that also invites us into more relationship with others.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I feel really grateful for getting to have this conversation that helps me hold how AI invites the village with more liberatory space.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Hmm.
Bye, y'all.